whenever you're ready.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today. We're going to be talking about healing through the psychoeducation of grief stages. And my husband and I are co-presenting today. I'll be presenting the material, although he's been very helpful in providing the material and working on this project together. A little bit about us. We actually met in our master's program for a clinical mental health degree. And then we became licensed together, married together, went through our PhD program together. And yes, we are still married and still going strong. That process has been, I don't know, about 20 years. We've been working in the mental health field for the last strongly for the last 15 years. And our primary focus has been with military families, working with military families who have transitioned overseas. More recently, though, we've seen grief as a primary element that's been coming to our counseling room. And so we kind of looked at grief a little more intentionally, and that's how this presentation came about. We also are instructors for Liberty University. That's our primary roles, and then we do some counseling work on the side. That's a little bit about us. As we get started today, I'd like for us to just begin with a timeout. And if you want to close your eyes, that's fine. However you choose to reflect. As you're reflecting, I'd like for you to think about a time when you experienced intense emotion. Could be sadness, could be anger, could be depression. Many different emotions come to mind when we say intense emotion. But if we could just take a moment to think about a time when we experienced that intensity. Now, as you're thinking about that moment, what emotions did you feel when you were going through that time in your life? Some things that might come to mind are sadness, depression, anger, guilt. What were the emotions associated with that intense time in your life? What about some of the thoughts that you had? What if I could change things? Or what if we had done this differently? How can I go on? What does this look like for me in the future? What is our next step? Reflect on some of the thoughts that you had related to this intense experience. Thank you guys for taking time to do that. And I want to point out that as we are going through the stages of grief, and we're talking about using those stages in a counseling setting, in a community setting, I'd like to encourage us to reflect on our personal experience and to think about how our personal experience may be unique to what we covered today. There should be similarities though, and also consider how our experiences may or may not be similar to those of the clients that we work with and things of that nature. I think it's important to also remember that in some way, grief is going to impact everyone. It kind of levels the playing ground, right? At some point, we're going to experience an intense emotion over something that occurs in our lives. And so it evens the playing field. We're going to be touched with grief in some way. And that's not unique to culture. It's not unique to age, to gender. I mean, it's a variable that we're all going to experience. Before we get started, we're going to have a little quiz. And when I hear the word quiz, I get a little nervous from college days and postgraduate degrees, but we don't have to be nervous about this quiz. It's just a brief little test your knowledge before, and then we're going to test again after. So if you could just think about these questions and answer true or false. Grief occurs only when there is a death. Would you say that's true or false? Grief occurs only when there is a death. The stages of grief occur in only one sequence. So we go through the sequence of the stages, and that's primarily how it's going to occur, and there's no altering those stages. And then grief occurs on an individual level only. So we only grieve personally, ourselves as an individual. We're going to revisit these questions at the end of the presentation, and you can kind of compare your before and after answers. So what are we going to go over today? Well, we're going to identify grief, and we're going to look at grief in two different facets. We're going to look at community grief, and we're also going to look at individual grief. We'll discuss many different grief factors. We're going to define the stages of grief. And then we're going to also look at an application of the grief stages, and we're particularly looking at that application from a psychoeducational focus, and how we can use psychoeducation to encourage and promote self-help with going through the grief process. So let's define a community. A community is a group of people. So we have more than one person, a group, and we're living in the same place, or perhaps we have some kind of characteristic that's in common. We might have a characteristic such as a cause that we share, or we may all have the same type of identity in some way. There's something that we share, or we live together. And some examples that we think of with community, maybe just where we live. So we might have an urban community, suburban, rural community, which is kind of comprises where we station ourselves. Community can also be centered around action. When we think about action, we think about maybe something we're passionate about, that we want to create change. We want to do something. And we have a group of folks who are also interested in the same area that we're interested in. We kind of talked about place a little bit already, but maybe in terms of practice, I often think of sports when I think of this. Individuals who are part of a community related to some type of sports activity, like the competitive dancers, or I think about soccer teams, baseball teams, things of that nature. Or it could be practice of some other type, maybe a law practice, or it could be practice related to environmentalism. And then also we have communities that can be built around circumstances. Some of those circumstances include maybe loss related to someone with cancer, and we form a community of individuals who've also shared that type of loss. Or COVID-19. I think we've seen many individuals who've come together as a community based on similarities that we share out of COVID-19. So our circumstances have caused us to build community. And then when we think of an individual related to community, we want to think about it impacting one person, a single person. And often this may be reflected in maybe loss of a loved one that we're not sharing with other individuals. It's our own personal loss, or it could be personal job loss, things of that nature. And when we look at community and the individual defined in terms of grief, what we want to add to this component is just the intense emotion. So when we look at a group of folks who have identified themselves as a community, when we look at grief, there's something that has triggered these folks to have a passion around a certain event, a certain activity, something that has occurred. And I think it's important to emphasize the intense emotion and the common factor. There's something that has brought this group of folks together. So we're focusing our community experience based on perhaps one event, something that's happened. And then when we look at the individual, we're just looking at the overwhelming emotion that's experienced by that person. There are many community grief factors that we've experienced over the last year and a half. One is related to social injustice, and I think about the untimely and traumatic deaths of George Flood and Breonna Taylor. We saw communities of individuals come together over intense emotion that was shared over these traumatic events. And so that's an example of how we develop community around something that we share an intense emotion about. When we think about COVID-19, we've seen communities come together out of a sense of loss, a sense of confusion, even just a sense of needing to belong to one another. And although this really hasn't happened face to face, we've seen this happen through social media. Folks are finding different outlets to use in order to reach one another. I think about school and work, for example. I know with my little ones, there's parents who are often organizing play dates, virtual play dates, and they're playing games together online. And so there's this sense of community that's being built around the school, and then also work-related activities, and how some folks maybe have used work as a social outlet. And I have clients who now are organizing events that would normally take place at work around the water cooler on social media, so that they have that outlet. But there's this sense of loss because the outlet that once was there is no longer there anymore. And so we see that with our schools, with our kids and things of that nature. We see this trying to change or make new, different, trying new ways to kind of get back what we did have. When we see political unrest in terms of grief factors, we've seen a divided nation in terms of where folks are falling on their political beliefs and how they want to interpret law and things of that nature. One example of that was the storm on the Capitol and how we saw that event unfold, and the emotions and everything that were created out of that event. And then we also see community grief factors in terms of causes. So environmentalism, I think of folks who fight strongly and fight hard to maybe have a certain law passed to protect a certain species and things of that nature. Or we might have animal rights advocates or victim advocates who come together and form a community because they are centered around a specific cause that they all believe in, that they all want to take part in and to create change with. When we look at individual grief factors, we think about adults, and I also think about children. And in terms of adults, I look at, and I have seen a loss of work. Folks are hurt, upset because they have unjustly lost work. Most of that's due to COVID-19, and employment's just not available, or businesses have shut down and things of that nature. There's also been this sense of loss in related to a change in their work environment. And so we have family members, individuals who were going into work, and now work is at home. And even if there's this transition now back to work, it's a slow transition and there's more work at home. And so the sense of environment and loss of that work environment, the collegial environment of, connecting with our peers and things of that nature is lost. We think of death. We've had significant loss. In general, we lose folks that we love, but particularly during COVID-19, we think about how this pandemic has caused loss in a way that we did not intend, that we were not factoring in, that we did not consider, we didn't think was going to happen. We think about relationship loss. And so what does this look like in terms of maybe divorce or loss of a friendship, things of that nature. Loss of rituals when mourning death. This is one that has really come up for several of my clients in terms of not being able to have what they would consider to be a proper funeral for their loved one when they've passed away. Some examples also include not being able to have community with them through the proceedings of the funeral, and family members, where there could only be, maybe 5 to 10 individuals, depending on how big the funeral home was, and trying to make sure all of the different codes are met in terms of COVID-19. And so we saw this just individuals who were expressing this sense of loss related to not being able to mourn their loved one in the way that they wanted to. And then activity lost. I think I see a news report every other day about how much weight we've gained over this COVID-19. And activity in general is lost. Just going out shopping, going out and experiencing a museum, things of that nature, things that families used to do. We see that sense of loss there. Our children have lost during this time, the loss of school. That's their community. And so there's this sense of them grieving what they no longer have in terms of being able to interact with peers as often as they were. Now, mind you, some are very excited about being at home and things of that nature, but we're seeing quite a few who are not and who are having a difficult time adjusting. And then they also experience the activity loss, particularly related to sports activities. Many of our school systems have limited or are not even having basketball, baseball season, all the different sports activities that our children are usually engaged in. So there's this sense of loss for our children. So now that we've looked at different ways that we experience loss, and also the definition of what we're looking at as far as community and individual grief. Let's take a look at the stages of grief. One of the things that I want to highlight is that we can experience grief in a variety of ways. And I mentioned this at the beginning as well. And the stages of grief can occur in a different order than what I'm presenting today. This is the most common, but it can occur in a different order. And there can also be a repeat of the different stages. And so maybe we've gone through a stage and we revisit that stage. It's not uncommon to see this happen either. So the first stage that we're going to look at is denial. And usually this is the first stage that an individual is going to go through when we are experiencing intense emotion over an event, over something that has happened. Usually there's thoughts that are related to what happened. We ask that question, or how am I going to go on? Or what am I going to do next? There's often this feeling of being numb. And so it's almost like there's an emotionless sense that's going on with us when we're going through this denial stage. And then there's also the shock. I can't believe this happened. And questioning, did this happen? And how could this have happened? And it's really our way of stepping back and saying, something's going on, but right now I need to protect myself. I need to not flood myself with the emotions that are there. And I need to just take a step back and allow myself to process this in a time that is comfortable for me. Some of the things that I think about when we look at community grief and denial, when we saw the traumatic events of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there were comments in the media, TV, I'm thinking of Facebook, I'm thinking of just various elements of media that we reviewed. And I heard themes of, I can't believe this has happened. Who can we trust? What's going on here? I mean, you heard this sense of denial, almost, how could this have happened with individuals? And so that's how we see kind of the community experiencing that sense of denial. Will things ever be the same? How will we get back to normal? Things of that nature. And then when we look at an individual sense of denial, we hear some of these same themes, particularly related around how I'm going to cope with what's next. What are my next steps? How am I going to move forward? Did this really happen? Those kinds of questions that we ask ourselves. If we have, for example, I've lost my job. I can't believe this just happened. Did I really lose my job? Let me just process for a minute what just took place. Those kinds of thoughts and themes are what we'll see in that denial stage for an individual person who's experiencing grief. And then we move to anger. And I think anger gets a really bad rap, because when we hear this term, we generally think of something that's negative. But anger is so important when we're going through the stages of grief. And it's important for us to embrace the intensity of anger, and to understand that what we're feeling is part of how we're going through the grief process. Anger can be extended toward anyone. And so, my favorite example for me is lashing out at my spouse, right? And we're both counselors, so we're not allowed to do that, but we do that. And especially when there's an intense emotion around something that I'm grieving, I certainly have lashed out at my spouse. Or it could be an authority figure, maybe someone who's not even related to the situation at all, but we're angry, and so we lash out at that person. But anger is the way that we are starting to work through this process. We're allowing ourselves to feel finally, and this is one of the ways that we kind of defend ourselves, and we kind of just generate this emotion and this intensity. And so it's very important. It's very important for us to understand what's happening, and that we're going through this, and that it's okay for us to do this. It's temporary, and it should be temporary, but it's very necessary for us to go through. When I think about Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I think one of the community examples that we saw of anger was just outrage. And we saw social unrest, and we saw individuals in a community lashing out and saying, hey, we're angry. This is not okay. And this is how we're expressing our grief over what happened. And it's important that we acknowledge that, and we talk about that, and we discuss that. When we look at COVID-19, we saw protests of folks wearing masks. And I would argue that that too was a sign of this anger of, we're losing something, whatever that individual may be feeling. I'm losing, there's a sense of loss, and now you're making me do this. And so, we saw folks who were protesting, I'm not going to wear my mask. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do, follow the government guidelines and things of that nature. And we also see anger just in general when we look at various groups and organizations who may be frustrated over certain policies and things that are taking place. All expressions of anger, both community and individuals who can express anger, but it's a very important part of the stages of grief that we need to kind of work through and understand. The next stage we're going to talk about is bargaining. And bargaining usually includes a lot of what if statements. So what if I had done this differently? What if I had tried to advocate for social justice more? Or what if I had just not allowed my husband, just had a cup of coffee with my husband and he would have been later leaving work and the accident wouldn't have happened? What if we had been more guarded when the virus was active and my loved one did not contract COVID-19 and get very sick or possibly even die? So we hear a lot of these what ifs. What could I have done differently? What are some of the things we kind of role play in our mind? How would I have done this in a different way? What could I have said? How did I play a role in what happened? We really want to just get things back to the way they were. And how can I get things back? We're trying to negotiate that piece of loss that we've had. There is no way to get it back, but we just keep asking ourselves what if statements and how we can move, how we can get back what it is that we've lost. And then finally, we look at, I'm sorry, not finally. Next, we're going to look at depression. And many folks meet depression in a way that I shouldn't be feeling this way. That's sometimes kind of what goes through our mind when we're in this stage of grief. And what's wrong with me? We're trying to figure out, well, what am I really depressed about? And these are all important questions, because when we ask ourselves, what are we depressed about? And we start to think about, okay, well, I'm depressed because of social injustice. I am depressed because I lost my job and now I can't pay rent. I'm depressed because I lost a loved one to death. We start asking ourselves those kinds of questions. And then when we say, wait a minute, I should feel this way. I should feel sad about this. I should feel depressed about this. And we can answer that question by saying, yes, I should. And then we can then start to think about, okay, what am I going to do next? Now that I know that it's okay for me to feel sad over this traumatic experience that I have this intense emotion about, I'm going to sit in this and I'm just going to allow myself to kind of feel that. But then I start to think about, okay, what can I do next? And how am I going to work through the next step? What do I have to look forward to? And then that's when we get into acceptance. It's so critical that when we're communicating the stages of grief, that we let our clients, our communities know that acceptance does not mean what's happened is okay. It doesn't negate the feelings, the loss that we've experienced, anything of that nature. It just means that we're at a point now where we want to try and look at next steps. We want to try to think about, okay, how can I reorganize? What are some of the adjustments that I can make to my life that will assist me in the next steps? How can I take the situation that has fueled so much intense emotion for me, and how can I make this something positive or create something positive out of this? When I think about community grief, and I come back to our example of George Flood and Breonna Taylor, I think about becoming an advocate for change. How can I advocate? Who can I contact? I can be involved in peaceful protests. I can be involved in contacting my congressman or congresswoman. I can be active in allowing my voice to be heard, and to also spread the word to others for getting their voices heard. When we think about individual loss related to work, I might start taking steps toward finding a new job. I'll sign up for unemployment, and so I have some income while I'm looking for other positions. I may even go back to school. I'm starting to think about how can I work through what's happened and in a way that can create positive change. When I think about our environment at home, we have families who are the word that's been used, or the phrase that I've heard often in counseling, is we're just locked in together and I just don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull my hair out because I'm teacher now, and I'm mom, and I'm caregiver, and I'm all these roles. And so we start to, okay, this is where we are, and how can I reorganize the house? How can I look at this and make a positive out of it? And part of that also includes, how can I reframe the way that I'm thinking about the situation, and things of that nature. So we are proposing to use psychoeducation as a way to help our communities and assist individuals with working through the grief process. And when we are utilizing psychoeducation, we are taking the transfer of information to provide support or training to promote self-help and self-care. And I think what's important to highlight here is self-help and self-care. We want to provide individuals the tools that they need, communities, the tools that they need to first recognize that they're going through the grief process. And then to look at, okay, now that I understand what the grief process is, here's what I know. Here's what I know is going to happen or could happen, kind of a general schema to get my arms around and my brain wrapped around what's happening and what I can expect. What I'm going through is normal. What I'm feeling is normal in terms of what we experience with grief. We are promoting psychoeducation mainly because of the results that we have seen from our own clients after they have seen, oh, wait a minute, this is grief. That's what I'm experiencing. And most folks do not have a label for grief. So they didn't even realize, oh, that's what I'm going through. And this is what that feels like. And this is what I can expect. And oh, I remember that. That is how I felt. It was so enlightening for them to be able to just understand what was happening with them. And then there's many research articles on the effectiveness of psychoeducation. I've just written some of those here, typed those out just to just kind of validate the use of psychoeducation with working through grief and helping promote individuals and communities to work through the grief process. So when we look at working through grief using psychoeducation with our communities, first we need an advocate. And I would say, let's be an advocate. Everyone here, we can be an advocate in some way. And when you're an advocate, you are, you're the point of contact. You're the person that is going to be looked on if there's a need, if a question comes up. You're the person who's kind of organizing. You're the main hub. And yes, this takes a village, so to speak, to advocate and to work through grief and to communicate the grief stages. But it starts with one person. And so we need to try and identify what area of grief that we want to look at. So when we look at our community, we need to see, okay, what's going on in my community? What does my community need? Which area should I start to promote educating about grief and how we're working through this process, and labeling for folks what's going on so that they can work through whatever intense feeling they have related to the circumstance. Some of the areas that we've noted would be the pandemic. I've had so many clients, and I've seen this on social media, Facebook and other places, and even community groups online, folks who are practicing maybe specific religious practices or community school groups and things of that nature. They're experiencing grief over what's happened with the pandemic. And so it's important to identify, oh, wait, this group could benefit from psychoeducation, and then kind of start from there. Does my community need psychoeducation related to grief in relationship to the political unrest that's taken place? And so we want to look at the different factors that cause grief, and what is it that my community is experiencing? And then, okay, now that I know what my community is experiencing, how can I be an advocate for that particular area? And really focus, the psychoeducational piece can be focused to that group in different ways. Also thinking about how you're going to get the message out to the community. There's many different avenues for that. The first that comes to mind is social media. We think about Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, all these different areas that we have accessible to us that do not cost anything. I particularly think about community groups that I'm involved in. I have a strong community of individuals that are related to my daughter's dance class. And so when I noticed that we weren't able to meet as a group and we weren't able to connect and have that comradeship that we used to have, I noticed that that community was becoming, they were just down. The expressions that I heard were related to the stages of grief. And so I just put out to our little group, our community, just kind of this informational brochure about grief and what grief looks like, and propose that, hey, I think we are working through the stages of grief in relationship to how the pandemic has impacted our community. And it was just so helpful for everyone. It really brought us together because the moms and the children were able to identify what they were going through, and they were able to kind of just sort of put their hands around, put their arms around, grasp what's taking place, and identify with what had been communicated. Yeah, this is what I'm feeling, and this does feel like grief. And then on an individual basis, we just recently, as I was going through this presentation, we were working on this presentation, my uncle passed away. And so my aunt, who is not, I think maybe it's more of a generational type thing, where she's just not in tune with emotions and exploring emotions and things of that nature. And she's in denial right now. And I was able to just kind of talk with her about the process of grief and what she might experience. And she just felt so relieved that the questions that she had and that she was asking herself were relevant, that she thought, oh, wait a minute, I'm okay, I can do this. This makes sense to me, and I understand where I'm coming from, what's going on with me right now. So I was able to communicate with her face to face. Sometimes in our communities, and particularly right now with the pandemic, we may not be able to do that. So social media is a great platform for that. I know most counseling is occurring online, but some practices are allowing with social distancing face to face. We've moved back into that now, so we may be able to communicate that face to face. When we have community events taking place, we can volunteer at local venues. And so I've seen and even had like a table set up, and we'll have brochures or just pamphlets related to whatever topic it may be. And in this case, we're talking about the stages of grief, to be able to just hand out to others so that they can come and just gather information about the stages of grief. And then community meetings and websites are also great ways that the advocate can kind of get the word out about grief and loss and the stages and what that looks like. I have to be honest, I've just noticed that we've got several folks chatting away in the chat. I see 33 entries there. I haven't been following the chat, but we'll get to that at the end. We'll have time to process and talk and ask questions, and maybe even go through some of those chat comments that have been put in there. So when we think about working through grief as an individual, I talked about my experience with my aunt, and it's particularly helpful with individuals who are not self-aware of emotion and what they're going through. It was just amazing. I can't even tell you how enlightening it was for her to just know that I'm normal. And that's with our clients as well. I've noticed one-on-one, there was just this sense of ownership of the process and what they were going through, and knowing what to expect was very important for the individuals that my husband and I have worked with. And it's important that we explore the situation because many times our clients do not have an outlet where they're able to look at every angle of what's happened with an experience. Many of my clients heard from other family members or friends, well, your husband's in a better place, or you didn't need your wife because she just battered all the time. Or, you really didn't like that job anyway, so now you have a chance to find a new one. Just these common phrases that we think are helpful to others, but really are not helpful to others. And so as the counselor, we can provide that opportunity for our client to be able to cover any aspect without judgment, right? Using that unconditional positive regard and empathic responses so that they are able to communicate the rawness of whatever may be on their hearts related to the situation. One other avenue too that I use in counseling at times is self-disclosure. And this is really a personal preference. But what I have found is that through self-disclosure, I analyze, okay, why am I doing this? Why am I disclosing maybe a personal loss for me, or my feelings, or my experience with grief? Why am I doing this? And if my answer is to benefit the client, to somehow assist through an impasse with the client, or for my client to feel understood or connected with the process that's going on in counseling. If my answer is yes to those areas, then I have found self-disclosure to be very impactful in therapy. And often hear comments related to how comforting it was for my client to know that others have gone through and go through this process, and to hear my experience, and to pick out similarities and differences, and to be able to process those and what that means to the client and what it means to me as well. And then in that process, and I touched on this earlier, also is just to educate our clients and make sure they understand what they're going through is a normal process. And if it's not normal, then we need to talk about that too. But in this presentation, we're really talking about just the stages of grief that are going to touch all of us at some point in life. So we want them to have tools, right? We want our clients to have tools when they leave the counseling session, so that they're able to process on their own, and maybe even come back to the education that we have provided, and to revisit that and to say, okay, this is what I learned in counseling. And although I thought I was accepting what had happened, now I find myself depressed again. And it's normal for me to go back and forth in the stages, and to experience anger again, or to lash out at someone. And of course, we want to give them tools to not, overextend anger and all these different emotions. But in this sense, we're just helping our clients to have education to move forward, because they're not going to always be with us. And so if they can take that with them, then they're able to process grief in the current situation that they have, and then also in future situations, because grief is something that we are going to deal with. And generally, we deal with grief multiple times over a lifetime. So let's take another time out, just like we did at the beginning of our time together. And thinking about what has been discussed today, reflect on your experience with grief. Did you find any commonalities in the stages that we discussed? What about in some of the questions that maybe you asked yourself? Did you find any similarities in what was discussed and a specific stage, and how you processed this experience, the traumatic experience or the intense experience? What about differences? Maybe your experience was completely different with grief. Perhaps you did not go through one of the stages that we talked about. Perhaps you went straight from anger to acceptance. Reflect on your personal experience in light of the information that's been presented today. As we're working with our clients, I want to encourage us to consider them as an individual. In everything. Today we're talking about grief, but there are many different factors that are going to come into play, such as cultural differences, and how grief is experienced and expressed with specific cultures. We're going to have differences related to gender. We may have differences related to worldview, religious perspectives. There may be all kinds of differences and similarities. The key, though, is to remember that our clients are individuals. Our communities are made up of individuals. And so when we are communicating our message, to just remember and reflect on that. And so we may change the approach that we take based on the community or the individual that we're speaking with, that we're working with. We may even need to look at the way we are communicating the stages of grief based on those factors. And always leave room and openness for how others will interpret or how others may experience grief, because it could be although I think we share the common theme of grief that touches our lives, the expression of that could be much different depending on many factors. And before we get to a question and answer and chat time, let's look at our questions again. We're going to have our post quiz and see how you answer these questions. So grief occurs only when there is a death. Who answered false? False is correct, because grief can occur under many different circumstances and situations. And I'd encourage us to just remember that. And our communities and individuals who are experiencing grief may not know that. I've heard so many times, well, it's not like I lost somebody. It's not like somebody died. And I hear that. I hear that comment in the counseling sessions, and I hear that in community groups. I hear that everywhere. It's not like someone died. But yes, that's true. Let's take a look, though, at what's happening here and identify this as grief, because that's what it is. Stages of grief occur in only one sequence. That one is also false. We can go through these stages in any kind of order, and even go back to a stage that we've previously been through. And then the other question was grief occurs on an individual level only, and that's false as well. And I hope that out of the presentation, we saw how communities can be formed around the group process. In most of what I see in the literature and in my work, I've seen this focus on individual grief, but there is really this sense of community grief. And I think we've seen that more in the last year and a half than we've ever seen that in our field. It's been very prominent. And so identifying that and identifying how we can be advocates of change for communities who are going through that grief process is very important. And I think that's all I have for us today, but I'd love to, any questions or thoughts from folks? I've got the, yes, Lindsay, when we were talking about the portion there about not even being able to grieve, what some folks would say is properly, we did have individuals who died alone in the hospital because they could not have visitors, which is very difficult to think about. And that sense of loss that we have related to that. Oh, I see. We have answers to the questions. False, 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 false. Oh, you guys are on it. You knew the answers, didn't you? What about any other questions related to anything related to the presentation, or does anyone have anything that you'd like to share about grief or your experience with grief in our little activity? Anyone have anything you'd like to share? Oh, Monica, I think I've experienced that so many times lately, not just with clients, but with just individuals that I'm talking with or that I encounter that I know from group activities and things of that nature, online, social media, things of that nature. It's interesting how the knowledge that we can impart related to, hey, you're experiencing grief, this is what grief is, and just kind of giving that to someone is just it really helps to lighten and like you said, bring on that light bulb moment for our loved ones and for others. Thank you for sharing that, Monica. And I'm sure other folks here have also seen grief just being displayed by family members, by communities, by individuals you're working with, clients, and things of that nature. I think if there are no other questions, is this a good time for us to close out?
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.